Disc jockey, drop the bass. Now the heads.
I've tried really hard not to get on the punch Sargon kind of trend that's going around, because I still like Sargon, and outside of a couple of things that he talks about, I think he does mostly good work and makes me laugh. I don't think Kekistan is terrible. I think it's quite funny and effective. But he's done three things just over the last day, really, which have pissed me off. Firstly, I was commenting on a tweet thread about Brexit, pointing out the semantic difference between arrogance and smugness, because people were calling people who'd called that Brexit was a terrible idea arrogant, and saying that was why people won. A fact to which I don't necessarily disagree. There was a problem of arrogance during the campaign. More effort should have been made to educate and talk to people, not in the SJW sense either. And then Sargon took it upon himself to quote reply to me, and my mentions for the rest of the day while I was trying to work were flooded with right-wing, nationalistic, clueless people boosting Brexit and basically proving my point that nobody seemed to know why they were in favour of Brexit over and over and over again. Though I still managed to exceed my word count for the day, so all good. The second thing that pissed me off was on the Rubin report, where he completely mischaracterised socialism. I'm used to this mistake from Americans because of basically McCarthyism miseducated a whole generation of Americans as to what communism versus socialism was, and has created this irrational fear in American society of anything left of Genghis Khan. I don't expect it from Brits, and I don't expect it from Brits who claim to be well read, and I don't expect it from Brits who are supposedly established within the liberal tradition. That pissed me off, and that's something that seems to be increasingly happening. And I try to explain to people the differences, but it never seems to stick, so I'm going to have to keep doing it. And the last thing that he did that pissed me off so much was that he drinks whiskey with ice. I don't care if it's that shitty American bourbon stuff. You never, ever, 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 ever drink whiskey with ice. It's just wrong. It's barbaric. I appreciate that the issue around socialism is confusing, and that largely stems from the fact that it gets used two ways as a term. In one way, it is used by Marxism, and Marxist socialism is the complete state takeover of absolutely everything in society. Everything is centralized, everything is run centrally. It's complete state socialism, and it's meant to be a transitional period between what went before and full communism, which is a completely stateless organization, which is something else that people don't understand. Communism has no state. It's entirely mutually run. There's no hierarchical apparatus whatsoever. Everything's held in the common weal, but there's no state. But state socialism is meant to be a path towards that. And that's the great failing of Marxism. By concentrating that much power in so few hands, the corruption is inevitable. And that's the same issue we face with practically all political creeds and ideologies. The problem of them all is power. In our current situation, corporations, moneyed interests, these have all the power, and as a result they are corrupting everything in our society. So it's always about balance. It's always about compromise, and without that you end up with situations like state socialism devolving into dictatorships and so on. That's the problem. That is the extent to which Marxism fails, and the extent to which communism, not socialism, has never been tried. Marxist socialism has been tried, it's a dismal failure. Socialism, on the other hand, has been tried and is a tremendous success. I appreciate that's confusing, but there is a non-Marxist meaning of socialism. That's socialism as its own ideology, not as a transitional stage towards communism from within Marxism. Socialism in that sense is not Marxist, though perhaps it draws on some of the same ideas and problems that Marx saw. That you could characterize, I guess, as democratic socialism. Now, pretty much every advanced Western nation is to one degree or another socialist. Even America. America still has welfare systems, America still has some state-run medical care. You know, these are socialist concepts. So, universal education, socialist. Right. NHS in the UK, socialist. The idea of total equality before the law, so the rich, the poor, the black, the white, everyone else gets supposedly treated the same in front of the courts, socialist concept. The idea that basic food, shelter, basic provision for people to have enough to survive, investment in the community in order to help people lift their way out of poverty and all that, these are all socialist ideas. It is socialism.
Wow, this is amazing, Dad. The most famous painting in the world. It's inspiring, isn't it?
Inspiring? Of course it's inspiring. Because it's Indian!
I appreciate that can sound like I'm claiming everything for socialism, including many things that liberals, in the classical sense, would claim as liberal, but this isn't incompatible. In many ways, socialism grows out of the liberal tradition, of empiricism, the Enlightenment, and all the rest. That's also a huge influence on socialism. I mean, you take liberalism and taken to one extreme, libertarianism, it's all about freedom too. It's all about breaking down any kind of restriction and providing massive individual freedom. Taken to the other extreme, it's all about freedom from, preventing you from starving or being on the street or whatever. So these are both types of freedom and they're in tension with each other, but they're both kinds of freedom. Socialism is heavily influenced and grown out of the liberal tradition and is very much focused on that provision. So via socialism, we're talking about things like stopping people starving, making sure they have a roof over their head, providing them an education, providing them a health service. In some instances, it's about state ownership of, important infrastructure like power, water, gas, mass transit, big social projects and things that improve the country and the standard of living for everybody. There's degrees and variances in that. Now, Bernie Sanders was right to point to Scandinavian countries as, exemplars of democratic socialism. Whatever their prime ministers or whatever might say, they are socialist countries. It's just a matter of degree. They are more socialist, and it does tend to be true that the countries with more socialism tend to be higher on the Human Development Index, tend to be happier. By no means are these perfect societies, but they're a hell of a lot better than the state of affairs in a lot of other nations. The objection to that label seems to stem from the fact that these are free market countries with private ownership. Those concepts are not incompatible with democratic socialism. They're incompatible with Marxist state socialism. They're not incompatible with socialism. Socialism does not eliminate private property. Some things, depending on the extent to which you go, may be taken into common ownership via the state, which is responsible to the people via democracy or some other means in some other models. Private property exists under socialism. Capitalism exists under socialism. It's just some things become state-owned. And I think anyone with a lick of sense can see how something like the health service does not work best under the private model. Because basically it's like putting a gun to someone's head and saying, give me your money. Because you really have no choice if you want to be healthy, if you want to live, than to pay up. And medical businesses shouldn't be businesses at all. They're not there in the business of making money, and aid should not be given in triage on the basis of money, but on the basis of need. And these are the establishing principles of the NHS, which is under threat by privatisation. But hopefully you see my point. If you reject socialism because you think it's communism, and you think communism is state socialism, you're making huge mistakes and you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Socialism is entirely compatible with the liberal tradition. Absolutely, completely. It's an outgrowth of it. And many of the things that we take pride in our societies, many of the things that we're envious of in other societies that are more successful, more fair, happier, these are all socialist things. So please, for the love of the fuck, stop getting it wrong. The second issue that I took, or that was thrust upon me, came from an argument over arrogance in relation to the Brexit vote. Not only were people accused of arrogance during the campaign, which I think is a valid complaint, but people are being accused of arrogance since, for kind of reveling in the fact that it's all going horribly wrong and that most, if not all, of the things that we said would happen are now happening. You know, the very capital flight that people are worried about with socialism is happening because of nationalism. Inflation's up. Businesses are fleeing. It's just one of the few pleasures that we Remainers can have out of this whole fucked up situation is the government failing and being proven right that this is a shit show and a stupid and bad idea and was a bad idea from the start. And then Sargon replied me about this, saying I was being arrogant for correcting semantics. I'm not sure about that, because arrogance is an incorrect overassessment of your abilities, and when it comes to language, at least, I know what I'm talking about. But it's not like we don't have the information on Brexit and who voted out and why they voted out. And when you break down those reasons and who voted, it's not unreasonable to say that they either didn't know what they were talking about, or were being misled by the tabloids, or in some cases, yes, were just plain dumb. That's a bitter pill to swallow, but I'm sorry, it's true. You look at the demography, and it was the relatively poor, the relatively uneducated. Now, that doesn't mean that they're stupid, but it does perhaps mean that they lack the necessary knowledge and understanding of what was going on. So, I kept asking these people who kept coming at me why they voted for Brexit, and I suggested to them that these reasons wouldn't hold water when you examined them. And they gave me their own personal reasons. They gave me reasons that other people voted for Brexit, and indeed they did not hold water. The main thrust of them was, well, one of them was sovereignty. No one particularly seems to understand what sovereignty means. It seems to be this kind of empty buzzword that gets thrown around. If you force someone to think about it, they'll maybe come to the point of, well, I want to have a say in laws and so on that apply to me. Well, that was never taken away. Europe was moving towards a federal model somewhat similar to the US, I guess, in which case you have the federal level, which would be equivalent to the European Parliament and so on, and then you have the state level, which is the national level. Yeah, that's the equivalency there. So, you vote in both your regional elections and your overarching elections, so you have sovereignty, you have a say, you have a vote. So where is the loss of sovereignty? You're not losing sovereignty, you're gaining sovereignty over a larger area. And so the complaint then becomes that, well, I don't think Germans should have a say on what happens to us. Well, you have a say on what happens to Germans. And how far are we going to take this objection? We can easily turn it into a reductio absurdum to point out the flaws in this line of reasoning. Well, if you think the rest of Europe shouldn't have a say over us, even though we participate and therefore have a say over the rest of Europe, where do you stop doing that? Should Scotland have a say over what happens in England? Should England have a say over what happens in Scotland? This is an ongoing debate here, even though we all have representation at the level of the UK. Okay, fine, let's talk about England then. Should I, as a resident of Hampshire, have a say over what happens in Cornwall? Should a resident in Cornwall have a say over what happens in Hampshire? You know, we have local councils, we have parish councils, you know, there's different stages of government all the way down with different levels of responsibility. And we have a participatory element in every stage of that. Things that happen at the higher level are things that affect everybody. Then you've got, you know, regional parliaments like Scotland and Wales, and hopefully eventually England, who have a certain degree of control over things that happen there. And this is no different to the European federal model whatsoever. And we have our vote and we have our say, which takes me into the next complaint, I guess. The next big thing that people make a fuss over is that Europe is somehow undemocratic. Now, this is ironic coming from people living in the UK. We have the profoundly undemocratic first past the post voting system. We have a House of Lords. We're a constitutional monarchy, but for all that is, you know, purely pomp and circumstance. It remains the fact that we are a constitutional monarchy. You know, these are not particularly democratic institutions, and many of the people who have huge influence over our government are not elected. The civil service is not elected. It has permanent secretaries and so on, who arguably have much more influence over policy and governance than the people we vote for. And you can say that the Lords is irrelevant, but they can propose amendments. It takes, I think it's 2-3 votes before they can be voted down and overcome by Parliament, because Parliament's sovereign. But Lords can also vote and participate in the executive, the cabinet, the group surrounding the Prime Minister. We do not directly elect our Prime Minister. We do not directly elect the executive. It is chosen. You know, so we already live within a profoundly undemocratic country, and Europe is, if anything, more democratic. So there are 3 parts to legislation, essentially, in Europe, and they're all roughly equal. So you've got the Council of Europe, which is, if I remember correctly, that's the one made up of the heads of all the EU countries. Now, the heads of all the EU countries are elected through one system or another, so there's democratic accountability there. Next, you have the European Commission, and this seems to be the sticking point for a lot of people. The body that they regard as being, you know, the most unelected. Now, the European Commission is appointed by the governments of the various nations, and you vote for the governments of the various nations. So, in essence, this isn't really any different to the cabinet in the UK. You don't directly vote for any members of the cabinet. You vote for a party who, from their number and from unelected bodies, like the Lords, will then select the executive. That's the equivalent here. So there is accountability at one step removed. You vote for your government chooses commissioners. That's how that works. And the last branch is the European Parliament, which we directly elect via proportional representation, which is much more democratic than our home system. So when you're complaining about the EU being undemocratic, you're talking out of your fucking ass, because it is. This is a problem. People were voting on things that they don't understand. And yes, European bureaucracy is rather opaque and difficult to understand and different to what we have in the UK, but it is not undemocratic. It could be more democratic. One of the problems that we have is that the EU Parliament cannot propose legislation of its own. Well, it kind of can. Members of the EU Parliament can propose legislation, but it has to be approved either by the Council or the Commission. It can make amendments. It can vote things down endlessly. There are aspects, and it has improved since it was first made. And it's probably the prime site for reform, as is the Commission. So there's room for reform in Europe. There's room for further democratization, and that has been the trend since the EU was created. But to call it undemocratic is just ignorant. So the last thing that people kept bringing up was jobs, employment, deprived areas in the UK, and trying to claim that this was somehow the fault of Europe, blaming it on immigration and so on. And I sympathise, I really do, but to me this is like some diabetic ham planet looking at their gangrenous left foot and thinking, oh my god, I have a serious problem here, and then levelling a shotgun at their right foot and blowing it off. Because it's a complete misdiagnosis of the problem to blame Europe for this. And that's another thing that's so frustrating. We've seen people vote massively against their own interests in this instance. Does anyone in a deprived area, in an area of high unemployment and other issues, really think that tanking the economy is going to make things any better for them? I submit that it won't, and that it will in fact make things worse. It's going to make things worse in an additional way, because our government has massively underinvested in these areas, because we've effectively been under a conservative government of one kind or another since 1979 or whatever. This is an issue. The only people to have really invested in these areas has been the EU. They have been a job provider, they have provided money to help out these areas and compensate for the problems they've had. That's now going to dry up. So, do you think that's going to improve the situation? I don't think that it is. But if we completely leave the EU, if we leave freedom of movement, you will no longer be able to Auf Wiedersehen pet your way across Europe, just as people won't be able to come here. But that's a two-edged sword. You're making things worse for yourself again, and having a negative impact on businesses, which means there's going to be less employment and less money. So all of these reasons that you've given for voting exit on that basis, it's all masochistic self-harm, because you're going to make things worse. I mean, even further, the wider economic effects. We're seeing inflation rise on essentials like food and fuel, and who is that going to affect most? That's going to affect the poorest most. So if that was your intention, you've got massive issues. We do have an immigration issue, but it's not people from Europe, and it's not something that's probably going to change, because we're still going to need immigrants for our hospitals, for all manner of things, because we don't produce those people at home, and that's our own fault. If we cut ourselves off from Europe, other things are going to get worse. The NHS is going to be put under more strain, not less, ironically, because that's another reason people give. So all of these reasons that people give for voting out are ignorant in the proper sense of the term, in that people didn't know what they were doing, or genuinely stupid, or acts of masochism. None of them stand up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. You just give them a slight poke and they tumble over. And yet, here we are in this stupid situation. There's a phenomenon that fraud investigators and police have to deal with, where people who've been conned don't want to admit that they've been conned. And the further they get drawn into a con, the more money and time and so on they invest in it, the more they lose to the con. Often in many ways, that gets them more invested in the con, and they become very resistant to the very idea that they have been lied to, manipulated and exploited. And honestly, I suspect that that's a lot of what's going on with Brexit. People bought into lies that have been perpetuated by the tabloids since the advent of the EU. People voted against their own self-interest. They're being bitten by their own bad decision. And yet we're supposed to somehow honour this. And they become quite vociferous and nasty in their arguments about it, even though it's obvious that the whole thing is a stupid idea at this point. You done been conned. Wake up to the fact. Use that rational brain that many of you claim to have, and examine it. Do a cost-benefit analysis here. You know, use your brain, not your heart. I got more stuff to talk about. There's censorship issues going on Amazon again, but this video's already too long, so I'll hit you up with that another time. Zang. Grim gave a big yawn and settled down to sleep. And of course, when Grim goes to sleep, all of his friends go to sleep too. The people on the internet were just text on a screen, the collectibles were just cheap plastic tat, and the books were just elaborate sandwiches made of wood and paper. Even Grim himself, once he was asleep, was just an old saggy goth twat, baggy and a bit loose at the seams, and nobody loved him.